Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing another Sharks player review. And today, fifth up, it is Nikolai Knyzhov. And it was a very crazy year for Nikolai Knyzhov, at least from his perspective. He came into this season probably thinking he may have a shot at making it as a sixth defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, and then by the end of the year, he was a solid part of the Sharks' top four, playing consistently on Erik Karlsson's pairing. And it was so crazy because of the fact that coming into this season, as I said, it wasn't really expected that he was going to be able to do much. The Sharks obviously had this hole at the sixth defenseman position. As I pointed out in the Mario Ferraro video, the Sharks' top five defensemen were pretty much just set in stone. Bernd Shemek, Karlsson, Vlasic, as well as Mario Ferraro. And while Ferraro moved up to that first pairing and Shemek moved down to the third pairing, the fact is those five guys still ended up playing mainly for this defensive squad. And the sixth defenseman was going to end up being some sort of rotating cast. However, come first game of the season, Radim Shemek was actually injured, and so the Sharks needed to get two defensemen to play on that third pairing, and those two defensemen ended up being Nicholas Milosh as well as Nikolai Knyzhov. And Knyzhov, once given this opportunity in game one, never relinquished it. He would then play game two, still with Shemek out with injury, but come game three, when Shemek would return to the lineup, Knyzhov would be the defenseman who'd manage to maintain that spot, and in the end would play all 56 games for the San Jose Sharks this season. And it was quite unexpected. I remember back in the 1920 prospect game that the Sharks had, that tournament that they played against the Ducks prospects, and I believe the Coyotes prospects as well. The player who mainly stood out for me during that tournament was Mario Ferraro, and it was not necessarily much of a surprise when he really stepped up to become a solid defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. But I remember watching Knyzhov in that tournament and then in subsequent preseason games of that season and never really being all that impressed. Now, Ferraro does play a game that would impress more to the eyes compared to Nikolai Knyzhov, and of course, I'm not some sort of amateur scout pro scout player who can somehow just manage to figure out what exactly players are going to amount to in their careers by just watching them. But personally, I never really saw anything in what Knyzhov was doing, and yet here we are to this day with him playing just a very solid top four defensive role for the San Jose Sharks. In terms of stats, he would have 2 goals on the year, which would put him on pace for 3 in a full season, 8 assists, which would put him on pace for 12 in a full season, for 10 points, which would put him on pace for 15 points. For a guy who was a bit more defensive, it is certainly not too bad to be putting up about 15 points in a full year. I would expect a bit more of an uptick next season. I felt like while it was more of a defensive season for Knyzhov, I felt as though there were a few sort of signs of life offensively from Knyzhov. A couple of his 2 goals came off of some pretty nice shots from him, and so I expect that there might be a slight uptick offensively, maybe in the 20 to 25 point range come next year, if of course he ends up playing consistently. When it comes to these young rookie defensemen for the San Jose Sharks, it has not been every single time that those guys have managed to maintain their spot in the lineup going into the year and the following year, and as such, while I would hope Knyzhov, and I think he can, just based on what we saw this season, you never really know. Moving on to his penalty minutes, and this is where there starts to be a bit of a black mark on his, report card this season, is that he ended up putting up about 39 penalty minutes this year, which was only behind a couple of players for the top spot on the Sharks roster, including Evander Kane, who of course was further up on the list. Now, why was Evander Kane still first, and yet I'm talking about Knyzhov in a bit of a negative light? Well, it is because of the stat that I mentioned back in that Evander Kane video, which was the net penalties, essentially penalties drawn minus penalties taken. So while Evander Kane had taken 21 minor penalties this season, he also drew 18 penalties, and as such ended up with a net penalties of just -3. However, Knyzhov took 16 minors and 17 general penalties this season, and yet only drew 4 penalties, giving him a net penalties of -13, which was worst on the team. And I understand that when you're a young defenseman, and especially when you're seeing a lot of the other young players around you on the roster getting benched for maybe minor mistakes, you're trying to maybe at times do a bit much to try and keep your spot in the lineup. Sometimes you don't want to let X player get around you or Y player beat you clean, and as such you start to take those silly hooking penalties or slashing penalties or interference penalties. And so it's a trap that Knyzhov ended up falling into a bit too much this season. I definitely understand that, but that's definitely going to be something that he'd have to clean up if he wants to start to be getting the bigger minutes on the year. For instance, we can actually compare him to another defenseman who takes a decent amount of penalties, which is, of course, Brent Burns, one of the few players on the team besides Vander Kane, actually the only other player on the team besides Vander Kane, who took more minor penalties than Knyzhov with 18. However, the fact is that Brent Burns took those 2 more minor penalties this season in almost 10 minutes more of ice time this season. There exists another stat, which is actually where you take the penalty minutes per game of a player and divide it by their time on ice per game, and you put that as a percentage. Nikolai Knyzhov is right near the top of the Sharks with a 4.2% of his time on ice being penalty minutes, while Brent Burns is further behind a good bunch of players at 2.5% of his time on ice being penalty minutes. And so even though Brent Burns is taking a decent amount of minors, he's doing it with a ton more ice time, and as such it averages out to many less. With Knyzhov, it would be expected at this pace, if his time on ice would rise to 20 minutes, 21 minutes, that his minor penalties would also rise pretty significantly, which is something that definitely should not be happening. So hopefully Knyzhov can clean up his game as we move forward. I will say Knyzhov this season also looked a bit to have at least a slight mean streak to his game. He ended up getting in a fight this season, his first NHL fight, of course, against the Minnesota Wild this year. And so that's something that I hope can stay in his game, to have that bit of physicality to it, but just clean up those silly minor penalties in his own zone. And finally, let's talk about his time on ice, 16 minutes and 44 seconds on the year. Not too surprising that this ends up being the 5th in terms of Sharks defensemen. It should be pointed out, of course, that Knyzhov early on this year was obviously, he didn't start off immediately on the Erik Karlsson pairing, and so he was getting, 10 minutes at his lowest. He was getting below 8 minutes in a specific game, but as the year went on, he started getting upwards, and near the end, he was averaging, I would say, at around 17 to 18 minutes per night. And so in general, it ended up being around what you would expect for a 4th defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. It should also be noted that while he was 5th on the team in terms of general time on ice, or for defensemen, of course, he was 4th on the team in terms of defensemen for even strength time on ice. It was because he actually was last on the team in terms of defensemen for shorthanded time on ice. Both Shemek and Vlasic placed above him, which also isn't that much of a surprise. Shemek and Vlasic, essentially their main strength is in the defensive zone. The reason that they end up being in this 3rd pairing is because they don't really play that 200-foot game all that well. They don't really have that transition game at all. But when it comes to just defending in your own zone on the penalty kill and having to clear out pucks, Vlasic and Shemek do excel in that somewhat. And Knyzhov was still rather young. The penalty kill is a bit of a different beast than just playing in your own defensive zone 5-on-5. So it is expected that he's being eased into that part of the game, and I suspect, if of course he is still playing a large role for the Sharks next season, to be getting an uptick in terms of shorthanded ice time. But considering all of these things, the fact that he heavily exceeded expectations, still played quite well, had a bit of a shaky end to this year. There was times where I thought he could be demoted from that Erik Karlsson pairing, although he kept his spot until the last game of the season. And of course, when you take into consideration that the penalty minutes were maybe a bit too high for me, in the end, he gets the grade that is still solid, though not insanely fantastic, of a B. Class dismissed.